You're not going to hear much about this on mainstream news. But beneath the surface of international trade, something massive is unfolding. Something with the potential to reshape the very foundation of North American agriculture. No protests sparked this moment. No headlines flashing in red. Just a quiet change. Mexico, one of the largest buyers of American corn, made a firm decision. Genetically modified corn can no longer be planted within its borders. The policy announcement slipped through unnoticed at first, buried in government bulletins and trade publications. At a glance, it appeared to be a minor domestic farming adjustment, a tweak in national policy, something easy to overlook. But in the weeks that followed, that single act triggered a chain reaction. Weak points in the U.S. farming economy began to surface. Long-standing trade dynamics started to wobble. A new agricultural force began emerging in North America. Canada. Instant crash came. But the shift didn't take long. Corn futures on the Chicago Board of Trade began dropping. Gradually at first, then with unmistakable speed. Shipping routes that once followed tight schedules suddenly slowed. Trains loaded with millions of bushels bound for the southern border began to stall. Rail yards across Kansas, Nebraska, and Illinois, once full of outbound grain, turned strangely still. For decades, American and Mexican farmers operated under a strong agricultural alliance. The North American Free Trade Agreement built a machine of trade so efficient, it became the standard. Corn crossed borders effortlessly. Revenues remained steady. Generations of farmers built their businesses on this steady stream. Government officials praised the system for years. Between 1994 and 2024, this trade relationship became a cornerstone of agriculture across the continent. U.S. corn exports to Mexico brought more than just cash flow. They sustained rural economies. By 2024, Mexico's demand reached nearly 25 million metric tons per year. That generated over $5.5 billion in annual revenue for the U.S. market. These weren't just abstract figures. Truck drivers relied on these routes for stable work. Railway companies scheduled entire operations around those shipments. Elevator operators, dock workers, processing plants. Every link in the supply chain benefited from this exchange. Thousands of families depended on it. And then, without a bang or warning, everything began to unravel. Mexico's move to reject genetically modified corn for human consumption proved more than symbolic. This was an operational cutoff. Over 90% of American corn contains genetic modifications, meaning nearly the entire U.S. export crop no longer met import standards. Border authorities turned away shipment after shipment. Rejection became the new norm. No outrage filled the airwaves. No breaking points exploded across the news cycle. Only a growing silence. Business calls went unreturned. Orders started thinning. Long-standing contracts began disappearing from the books. Containers that once moved without pause found themselves stuck in limbo. Every step of the process that once ran on routine now faced disruption. While U.S. farmers and exporters wrestled with uncertainty, a quiet rise was taking place in the north. Ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert along Canada's west coast began to handle a growing volume of corn shipments, originating deep in the prairie provinces. Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario. These weren't random or temporary exports. The process appeared well-coordinated, well-supported, and fully welcomed. Mexican buyers who had closed the door on American corn started accepting Canadian grain with open arms. No resistance met the deliveries. Border agents cleared the cargo swiftly. Everything checked out. Customs paperwork lined up without a hitch. Because years of preparation had built a reliable system north of the border. No loud speeches came from officials. No dramatic policy changes made headlines. Just years of careful, deliberate planning. Canadian farmers, shippers, and regulators developed a different kind of agriculture, one built on transparency and consistency rather than volume. A system called Prairie Trace took center stage. This blockchain-based platform documents every single step, from the planting of the seed to the arrival at the port. Buyers receive more than just a bulk crop. They get a full digital trail. Seed variety, type and amount of fertilizer used, irrigation records, weather data, pesticide applications, harvest timing, even rail transport history from the farm all the way to the export terminal. Each kernel arrives with a story in a world shaped by health concerns, environmental questions, and ethical scrutiny. That kind of clarity carries weight. Trust becomes a product. Data becomes value. The difference between anonymous grain and accountable food becomes impossible to ignore. Prairie Trace transformed the Canadian agriculture landscape. What began as a limited pilot among a few hundred farms soon scaled into a national movement. Exporters, rail companies, and government agencies joined forces. The goal remained simple: build trust that holds shipment after shipment. And the rest of the world took notice. South Korean food buyers, European regulators, Japanese manufacturers, all began to view Canadian corn differently. Not just another grain, this became a dependable piece of a global food supply. That dependability came with a higher price tag. While U.S. corn dipped to $4.50 per bushel, Canadian grain from Manitoba reached $4.70. Ontario's premium corn sold at $6.30. Not due to taste or nutrition, but because buyers knew what they were getting. In an unpredictable global market, confidence in a product becomes priceless. And this marks only the beginning. While Canadian corn was steadily moving through Pacific ports, backed by systems that guaranteed transparency and accountability, the U.S. was entering unfamiliar territory, one marked by instability, bureaucratic friction, and an increasingly fragile image abroad. In early 2025, new tariffs were imposed by the U.S. government on cargo vessels associated with a specific Asian shipping conglomerate. These ships, which formed a backbone of U.S. agricultural exports to Asia and Latin America, were now subject to added costs and stricter security protocols. The move was intended to demonstrate political resolve. But for American corn exporters, it was a direct hit. Shipping costs surged. Insurance premiums ballooned. Suddenly, it was 25% more expensive just to move a container from Louisiana to Veracruz or Busan. Exporters who had already locked in contracts months in advance were now faced with an impossible decision: eat the loss or walk away. Many simply canceled. Others renegotiated at a loss. A few smaller firms shut their doors entirely. Meanwhile, competitors stepped in. Canadian corn shipments moved under different terms. Thanks to bilateral trade agreements between Ottawa and key partners, Canadian corn, especially that labeled organic or non-GMO, was increasingly exempt from reinspection in countries like South Korea, Singapore, and Germany. That alone shaved days off transit time and eliminated thousands of dollars in inspection fees. For buyers under pressure to secure consistent and clean supply chains, the math became obvious. And while Canada was building bridges, the U.S. found itself tightening restrictions. The Federal Grain Inspection Service, FGIS, rolled out new standards for export-bound corn shipments, especially those moving through southern ports like New Orleans, Corpus Christi, and Houston. Concerns over chemical residues, mold, and glyphosate traces prompted a surge in inspections. What was once a routine 5-hour screening now turned into a 48-hour ordeal. Test failures triggered immediate rejection. Entire batches of corn, valued in the millions, were being discarded, sent back, or locked in legal limbo at the same time. Domestic pressures were mounting. Corn prices on the Chicago Board of Trade had fallen below $3.50 per bushel, the lowest in nearly a decade. For farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska, who were facing average production costs of around $165 per acre, that number was devastating. There was no margin, no room for missteps. In many cases, planting meant guaranteed losses. The ripple effects were brutal. Grain elevators that once hummed with activity were now operating on skeleton crews. Trucking companies began canceling rural routes altogether. There simply wasn't enough movement to justify the fuel. Farmers who had held out, hoping for a rebound in prices, now found themselves buried in unsold inventory. Silos filled, then overflowed. Grain bags, those long plastic tubes normally reserved for backup storage, became the primary solution. But even those ran out. Farmers turned to renting commercial warehouse space. Some began storing corn in old barns, garages, even empty houses. Storage wasn't just a cost. It was a race against time. Moisture, rodents, temperature swings, All could destroy stored grain and turn a bad year into an unrecoverable disaster. By the middle of 2025, thousands of corn producers across the Midwest were staring at the same brutal calculus. Plant and lose, or don't plant at all. Many chose the latter. Entire fields went fallow. Machinery sat idle. Auctions began to appear. Equipment, trucks, even parcels of farmland were put up for sale. Some farmers, facing debts from the previous season, took construction jobs in nearby towns. Others found work hauling freight, driving for delivery services, or picking up seasonal labor on other farms. There was no shame, only survival. In counties where agriculture had been the cultural and economic backbone for generations, a quiet despair began to take root. Farming was no longer a promise. It was a risk with no reward, and the emotional cost was just as sharp as the financial one in small towns across the Corn Belt. Cafes that once buzzed with talk of harvest forecasts and market trends now echoed with silence. Men and women who had grown up in farming families began having hard conversations at kitchen tables. How much longer can we keep going? What do we do if next year is worse? For many, it wasn't just about the money. It was about identity, purpose, pride. In an industry where success is measured in seasons, and tradition is passed down through seed catalogs and machinery manuals, the collapse felt deeply personal. And still, the grain kept piling up. The southern ports, corn vessels sat idle. Not because there was no demand globally, but because buyers had changed their terms. They no longer wanted just volume. They wanted guarantees, certifications, proof. And while Canada was offering that proof in neatly packaged digital manifests, backed by government and third-party oversight, the U.S. was trapped in a maze of reactive policy and outdated logistics. The ethanol industry, long a reliable safety net for surplus corn, was cracking 2.25 plants across the Midwest, including giants like Valero and Green Plains, either paused or scaled back operations by the end of the second quarter. Rising input costs, declining gasoline demand, and tighter environmental regulations made it harder to profit. Ethanol capacity dipped below 88%, the lowest since 2016. Thousands of workers were furloughed. Ethanol blending margins collapsed. Corn that would have once flowed into fuel plants now had nowhere to go. Supply chains began to unwind. Processors couldn't keep up with shifting standards. Exporters couldn't justify rising freight costs. Farmers couldn't afford storage, much less profit. The value chain that had kept U.S. agriculture strong for generations was fraying at every link. And then came the rivers. For the third year in a row, water levels along the Mississippi River, America's agricultural superhighway, remained dangerously low. Barge traffic slowed to a crawl. Some routes were shut down entirely. Vessels had to lighten their loads by 30 to 40% just to remain operable. Each detour added cost. Each delay added risk. And it all translated into lost contracts. Buyers in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe didn't stop purchasing corn. They just found it elsewhere. The new narrative was clear. Volume alone wasn't enough. It wasn't about who had the most corn. It was about who had the right corn. Clean, verified, traceable, ethically grown, sustainably harvested, efficiently transported. And in this new reality, Canada wasn't just participating. Canada was leading. From the fields of Saskatchewan to the rail lines of British Columbia, Canada wasn't just growing corn, it was growing trust. Slowly, deliberately, an alliance had formed between farmers, the federal government, and precision logistics companies. This wasn't only about exports, it was strategy. While the U.S. clung to old assumptions, Canada leaned into a changing global reality. Climate concerns, food safety, soil health, and traceability. Ottawa funded regenerative farming, renewable-powered grain drying, and modernized rail systems. It wasn't one big reform, it was hundreds of small, consistent moves. By 2025, Canada had a finely tuned export machine. Asian and European buyers praised its clean passport for grain. In Mexico, processors canceled U.S. corn contracts citing chemical drift and consumer backlash, shifting to Canadian suppliers. Globally, drought in Argentina, floods in Brazil, and war in Ukraine made Canada's stability even more valuable. Canadian exports to Asia rose 41%. Mexico's imports more than doubled. Japan and Singapore signed long-term GMO-free deals. These weren't spot buys. They signaled a lasting shift. Trust mattered more than price. South of the border, the U.S. faced crop failures, fungal outbreaks, residue scandals, and tightening environmental rules. Silos overflowed. Shipments sat in limbo. By late summer, 38 million bushels of corn were stuck in bureaucratic gridlock, degrading by the day Canada's trains moved. Its ports loaded. Its reputation soared. U.S. market share hit a 30-year low, while Canada's reached record highs, owning the category of clean, transparent, verified grain in rural America. Confidence cracked. Farmers spoke of losses, loan defaults, and survival rather than growth. Young people left family farms. Equipment sat idle. The culture itself felt at risk. Meanwhile, Canadian agriculture evolved, expanding acreage, testing climate-resistant hybrids, investing in blockchain verification, and attracting global partnerships. Multinational brands began planning to source all their North American corn from Canada by 2027. The U.S. ethanol industry faltered. Town economies shrank. In Canada, agriculture became a diplomatic tool, a model of traceability, low-impact farming, and data-backed accountability. Countries like Chile, Australia, and France sought to replicate it. For the U.S., the problem wasn't just losing contracts, it was losing trust. And trust can't be rebuilt with press releases. It takes